But let's go through how to build a test framework. So we kind of broke this out into the 3Ds. We thought that was pretty easy to remember. And so you'll see our little zombie buddy in honor of Halloween here in the States for the first D, which is to define. So when you start with the 3Ds of testing, you need to start by defining. And the first part is kind of the easy part, right? It's defining your workflows. You know, you need to start with your requirements, which we've talked about. As we said, each requirement should have at least one test case. You need to be able to identify your common workflows throughout your application under test. And, you know, it's kind of funny, we heard this crop up the first time we did this webinar earlier this morning as well, was this concept of user stories. So if you're already using user stories, you're already mostly there. So we're going to walk you through kind of an example that both Jeff and I worked on while we were here, just the past couple months that we've been working on, and how we came up with multiple workflows, but how it was really important that we had two workflows that maybe were similar, but we still needed to detail them out because they were still different.
And I'm waiting for somebody to say, show us an example, so we are going to. However, it's kind of important to kind of start from the very beginning, right? So we're going to walk through the beginning, middle, end, and the results, actually, of a real example that we did on QAcomplete.com. So this is a pretty full-featured going through there. Now, this is one piece, and we'll talk about how you take this piece, expand it, and then build out a whole framework in a similar manner. Absolutely. But maybe the best thing to do is to kind of, I guess, move on into the next piece.
Yep. So this was something I was tasked with along with Jeff, and, you know, it was important. We were like, okay, what do we need to figure out for, in our case, we were working on a ROI calculator for a new website, QAcomplete.com, which we just launched. And it was like, who will be going to look at this calculator? Most likely a QA Complete prospect. Why are they looking at it? They're probably interested in determining whether or not QA Complete is a good investment for themselves, whether it's the right tool and how they can prove it to their manager. And then finally, where will this be? This is really important. We need to remember that whatever we're building out will live in another environment. In our case, it was living on a web browser. Where would this web browser need to be accessed? Would it need to be on would it need to be on a Windows machine? Would it need to be on a Mac? Would it be all over the world? Would it just be in the States? These are all a lot of considerations that we needed to think about. And it's really important in this defining phase to go back and do those tedious details of like, oh man, I know these questions are like really basic, but I need to figure it out. Who is using this? Why are they using it? And what context are they going to be using this application?
And that's what it boils down to. It's who, what, and where. It's kind of simple, right? I guess we could have done the 3 W's here.
Yeah.
But look, if anybody's used to user stories, they have that idea of a role. You know, we phrase it this way as a prospect, right? That's a role. What's often missing in a lot of those frameworks is a perspective. So the role is good. It helps fill in unwritten requirements. The perspective tells you the why. It fills in more. This is actually almost more important for testing than it is for development. And then the context, well, okay, the context is where does this all live? You know, of course it's going to be in a web browser. Is it mobile? Is it, you know, how are people consuming it? And of course this is mostly applicable to things that are used by a human. Things that are used by a computer do also have context and perspective and role, but humans are just harder to understand.
Absolutely. So you want to touch on, so we do have an example, as we've talked about, our ROI calculator. Jeff, I'll pass this one over to you. I've been hogging the slides.
That's fair enough. So, you know, actually, you know what? I'm gonna just skip to the next slide.
Okay.
Look at that. I responded to you doing that. I wanted to actually show the ROI calculator. That's okay. So what does it do? What does this thing do? We do 4 inputs, 3 pieces of data coming back, showing that the return on investment of buying QA Complete. And then we want to give you different ways of consuming that information, a print button, a contact us button. So that's the general requirement, and we've put it with very minimal variation here. You know, this is the happy path, the standardized use case Of course, other people can come in and do other things, but I'm not dealing with variations like they change the input 30 times. It's just the nice, clean, desired path.
Yeah.
And that's where my test workflow starts.
Absolutely, and I think it's exactly what you said, right? There's this whole idea of variation. How many variables can you truly control? At the end of the day, most of the applications you all are working on are not this simple. This is a really simple one that Jeff and I were working on, but even in this case, it was a really simple one, right? But look at all this variation we had. Our desired path was still to strip away as much variation as possible, only doing 4 inputs, only having 3 pieces of return data, and only having 2 exit strategies at the end of the day. So it is really important to figure out what is that desired path with minimal variation. And that leads us to our next D, which is the second D for how to build a test framework for decomposing.
Yeah, a little zombie inspiration there, I think. So great, you've got this workflow, but that's actually not very useful. You have to break it down. And generally speaking, you want to break it down into really atomic, I don't know if that might be a me word, small, very small, as small as reasonable, and that it's still useful. You don't want to get crazy on how far you break it down. So what level is reasonable but not crazy? Well, individual actions, especially ones that provide an input, the results of those actions, the logic between them, and then what a lot of people forget is the exit points, because you almost always have more than one. And this is all a little bit of art, because you do need to know the application under test a bit. Those exit points, though, are going to be very important when we stitch one workflow to other workflows.
Yeah, you're right on. And you used that word atomic there, Jeff. And I think we got a couple questions earlier about the difference. What did you mean? Did you mean a unit test when you were saying this? So could you address that? Because I do see some things coming in about unit testing.
Yeah, sure. So units is a developer phrase, really. That usually means individual functions, right? We're not testing functions here. Some of these actions could be triggering all sorts of different items in the background. We're looking at it from the user's perspective. Individual actions from a user. That's not really a unit. It's something else atomic.
Yep. So we're going to move on to talking about how we decomposed our workflow. So, we broke it down, and any type of workflow will need this. You have to break it down into your inputs, your outputs, and your exits. So as you can see here, we had multiple types of inputs. We had the number of team members, the requirements to be implemented this year, test cases for each requirement, and then the option of SaaS versus on-prem. Of course, now we had inputs that could be entered in 2 ways. We had a sliding option, and then we also had a place where you could type them. And that was available for all 3 of these options, and then also switching back and forth, making it a little bit more complicated, adding to more variety. Then we also had some outputs. We had the implementation cost, we had the savings available, and then we had the ROI. So 3 more options with 3 more outputs. And then finally, we had 2 exit strategies. Something I completely forgot when I was helping design this page was we need some way for them to be able to contact us or for them to be able to share and print the results. So it really is important. We knew this journey. We wanted to walk people down. We knew the type of workflow, but what were those true inputs, those outputs, and those exits? And that's really what the decomposing step of building your test framework is about.
Yeah, and this is where we start getting into the kind of meatier pieces, right? Right, so we have a workflow that's usually maybe a user stories, only a few lines. Just breaking it out into a workflow, a few more lines. But now we're getting down to the actual real pieces. So that user story that might have been 3 or 4 lines is now 9 individual actions. And you'll note that a few of them even have ors in them, which is pretty much everything 1, 2, 3, and 4 has an or. That rhymed. Pretty hard to say that. But that's where we're at. So what do we do next? Well, we take those actions and we break apart those or statements. And I'm going to anticipate a question we got a lot on the European version of this, which is why? Why am I breaking out these two pieces? Well, importantly, inputs do actually add failure points. In our example here, we actually have a real bug. You can go on QAcomplete.com and click the ROI calculator and you can see this bug that we haven't fixed yet, which is the slider bottoms out at 1. I can slide it all the way to the left. The control, where you type things in, is actually it's a type-in field, but you can enter 0. So you can get to situations that I don't want as the product guy, and that Bria doesn't want from the marketing side, which is things like seeing a $0 ROI. That's not something we want to present. If I was only testing the slider, I wouldn't have caught that. So those two different inputs, they're common failure points. I mean, at the end of the day, it's not like the computer's going to get the math wrong. We don't have to go that far. Sure, complex things we're going to have to check. But where do bugs show up in modern applications? Things like that.
Yeah, well, I want to first say thank you, Jeff, for definitely telling all these QA engineers that I made a big mistake on the website in our application in our ROI calculator. Thanks for outing me there. But additionally, as QA engineers, you kind of know that frame of mind you need to have, right? You need to anticipate what's going to go wrong or start troubleshooting, and that's why this or statement should be broken out. Because until recently, we didn't even realize that this could have gone wrong, to be quite honest. And had we maybe done a better job decomposing our workflow, we probably would have figured it out a little bit sooner and done some better checking for what would have been our checkpoints here in our situation.
Yeah, and so you'll notice that those two workflows, right, they both end the same. And that's really important as we kind of move on towards how we're going to reuse pieces. So I guess kind of with that said, we should probably move into, okay, great. This is how you break down a test, break down a workflow. How do we get to a framework?
Yeah, I mean, this is the third D, and then we will go into the elements of a test framework. But really how we build it, what's that last thing that you need to figure out? You got to make some decisions. And so that is why the third D is to decide. And so we wanted to give you some examples of things you should probably consider when you need to make some decisions. We kind of touched on this a little bit earlier in what you need to decide on, your environments and your context to cover. So you're going to have different operating systems all over the world. You're going to have way too many browsers that are constantly updating. You're going to have a lot of devices, and who knows in a year what Apple or Samsung or who even knows what's going to be coming out next. And you're going to need to be able to anticipate when your application is going to be needed or used on another device. You also have security permissions. Should everyone have access to this? Should only other people have access to this? You'll have user roles kind of tied in with that security permissions. And finally, you will have conflicting softwares. So throughout all of this, there are many points that you need to make some decisions. And so you're not going to be able to most likely cover every single operating system, every device, every browser, so on and so forth. So you have to decide what is important for you to cover for your application under test.
Yeah, and we spent some time on this particular list because there's some things people just don't remember about their environments. The two that always stick out to me are the security permissions and conflicting software. So the kind of bigger picture there, the actual security permissions you have in your application matter quite a lot. And normal workflows through an authenticated system should cover both. Conflicting software is a more complex thing. That's things like antivirus. We have an automation tool, Test Complete, that we have to put a lot of effort into making sure we work okay with a conflict with antivirus or anti-malware. So this is all dictated by your application under test.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there comes another decision you got to make. What tasks or what steps repeat? And so Jeff's touched on this a bit as far as reusing. And so you've decomposed all your major workflows. You want to find what are commonly reused steps and actions. In our situation, we had the repeating steps of workflow 1 and workflow 2. So while they were an or, they also had repeating steps as far as their inputs went.
Yeah, and this is really important, right? So we've broken down inputs and outputs, and now we're trying to look for those commonalities as we go further into building the actual framework around this one test.
Yeah. And then finally, probably a big decision that a lot of people come to is what to automate. I really enjoyed someone's question today on why not automate everything. And I think after this slide, maybe we can circle back to that question.
Sure. So this is kind of important. Very few things are very clear-cut on whether or not you should automate them. There are a few, right? So things like data entry, humans kind of stink at repetitive data entry. So any of those actions that involve entering data are really good candidates. There's other pieces that, again, it's just not necessary to have a human. Environment setup or tear down or cleaning up a database afterwards, that doesn't need to be done by a human. But there are other ones as well. Things that humans just can't do well. Screen responsiveness. What are you going to do? Sit there with a timer, checking to make sure your mobile app works for, in sub 1 second timeframes, or things that are just very boring. The first thing when people ask about, what to automate, I go, what do you hate doing as a manual tester? Start there, because if you do those first, you'll love it. But there are some other ones, and I'll let Bria kind of finish the slide there.
Yeah, I think it makes so much sense also too when you don't like a task, you will often make more mistakes, right? So why not let a computer that can automate something and go a lot faster than you do those boring tasks that you really don't want to do anyway? And then you have tasks that have a really high reuse value. So as we just gave an example in workflow 1 versus workflow 2, there were those opportunities to reuse a lot of the materials. So those looks like good candidates for automating. And then you have tests with timing or screen responsiveness, such as a criteria for success. And so when you do have something with a criteria for success, that's how quickly can something respond, it is most likely a really good option to automate. And then you have, of course, other types of non-functional test typing, such as performance testing, load testing. These are also really great options. And then finally, you have the opportunity to capture results. So if you want to capture multiple results at multiple phases, why not automate that? So I think that brings us to our question of, why not automate everything, Jeff? And I think you touched base on it a little bit, but as long as humans are going to be interacting with these machines, you're going to need some human manual testers at the end of the day. It is very hard to automate all of your processes, and I actually have never spoken to someone who has been able to do so. And so with that, whether it's exploratory testing or whatnot, you're always going to need a human to poke at it and figure out what you can, figure out the loopholes and things. However, that does not mean that you shouldn't switch to any automation, because automation can definitely save a lot of time and allow you to do other types of testing or other types of activities that you may be responsible for.